Welcome everybody. My name is Ole Jakob Sending. I'm Director of Research here at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, NUPI. It's a great pleasure and honor for us to welcome Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of New Zealand, the Right Honourable Winston Peters. Minister Peters has a long and distinguished political career, starting with being elected to Parliament in 1978, establishing political party New Zealand First in 1993, serving as Foreign Minister and also as Deputy Prime Minister earlier. We have about 50 minutes, I've been told, with you today, sir, and we look forward to hearing you talk. I should stress that this event will be streamed. Now, just for context, from the perspective of us here at NUPI, Norway and New Zealand is quite far apart in terms of geography, but they're also quite similar. Constitutional monarchy, parliamentary democracy, a unitary state, a history of consensus in politics, and of course beautiful nature. And given the challenges that we're observing in the international society to date, being a fairly small country, dependent upon and benefiting from an international rules-based order, we look very much forward to hearing your thoughts, Minister, on New Zealand's foreign policy priorities. And with that, I give the floor to you, and there will be a little bit of time, we hope, for questions and comments afterwards. Thank you.
Director, ladies and gentlemen, tak og velkommen. Greetings, good afternoon, and above all, thank you for coming out today. Now, for many of you living here in Norway, it must seem that New Zealand is a country at the very end of the earth. And having made the flight here, we can confirm with my colleagues that you're absolutely right. Whilst we're about as far away as Norway as you can travel, this is just a geographic separation. Despite distance, we are close partners. We share a great number of similar values and experiences, but there is much potential for Norway and New Zealand to be even closer partners still. Sadly, the terrorist attack that took place in Christchurch in the South Island of New Zealand on the 15th of March means that we also share the experience of a horrific attack on home soil. And it's no exaggeration to say that that day on the 15th of March, we lost our innocence and our world changed forever. We endured an utterly callous act of terrorism perpetrated by a coward against our people praying in their mosques. Now, we know that Norway has suffered a similar brutal attack of terrorism on the 22nd of July 2011. And we are utterly grateful for the messages of support and sympathy and solidarity that we received from all over the world, but particularly from Norway, having regard to its past experience, and including from His Majesty King Harald the Fifth Father, and Prime Minister Solberg. And following the attack in Christchurch, we are grateful that Norway also offered its very practical support and offered to share the lessons learned following your experience 8 years ago. We will visit the memorial today in Oslo and lay a wreath in remembrance of those lives that were lost. And friendships such as ours assume even greater significance in these difficult times. Many have asked whether New Zealand's foreign policy settings have shifted in the wake of the Christchurch attacks. And the answer is that while the act of terrorism disrupted our national life for a time, New Zealand's foreign policy continuity is not disturbed because the foundations are deeply rooted in our national values and experience. The values that drive us remain strong, and they are to summate equality, tolerance and fairness. Democracy. New Zealand is one of only 9 countries with an uninterrupted sequence of holding democratic elections since 1854. The third is freedom from fear and from want. The fourth is human rights as set out in the 1948 Universal Declaration. And last, guardianship, or what the Maori people and the native people of New Zealand call kaitiakatanga, which is guardianship of our environment. Our foreign policy has and will always be driven by clear-eyed assessment of New Zealand's interests and these bedrock New Zealand values. While saying that, we recognise that achieving solutions that advance our interests and align with our values depends on the ability to work with other countries. New Zealand's Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, said in her first major foreign policy speech, and I quote her, she said, "We speak up for what we believe in, stand up when our values are challenged, and work tirelessly to draw in partners with shared views," unquote. There are few places in the world that are as close to us in terms of values and how we see the world, and they see the world, as Norway and your Nordic neighbours. Domestically, we both enjoy high standards of governance, consistently taking out the top spots in international surveys, reflecting transparency, and dare I say it, the absence of corruption. Norway and New Zealand lead the world in most global measures of equality, peacefulness, personal freedom, and respect for human rights. We also share a record of being trailblazers in terms of social justice. You may know that New Zealand was the first country in the world where women achieved the vote, and that was way back in 1893. Nordic countries have also been global leaders on gender empowerment. Given the leadership Nordic nations have shown in providing for the poor and vulnerable in their societies, it may interest you to know that New Zealand created the first comprehensive welfare state in the 1930s. I don't want to be political, of course, but that happened to be when a new Labour Party came into power in 1935 after the Great Depression. And after years of being in the political wilderness, the upshot of that highly successful economic revolution, 35, 38 and onto the 40s, was that the Conservative Party decided to steal their lines and change the phraseology around what they were doing and turned it into, quotes, a capitalist owning democracy. And the rest is history, because they were very successful selling the same message, but from a different point of view. But I digress. I'm getting back to what we're here for this afternoon. Our countries have also applied this value-driven approach on the global stage, often in partnership and with each other. We share similar worldviews on global issues. These include trade, the environment, human rights, disarmament, peace and security, as evidenced by our close collaboration when New Zealand recently served on the UN Security Council, and we also have an adherence to the international rules-based system. And we cannot possibly, as small countries, ever understate the importance of adherence to the international rules-based system. We are instinctive and active multilateralists who are unafraid to stand up for what we believe in. Within the United Nations, Norway and New Zealand collaborate pragmatically and effectively within a small, like-minded grouping of states appropriately known as the, quotes, the mountains, end of quotes. New Zealand and Norway are both active contributors to international peace and security, including as mediators and regular contributors to peace operations. And we both have strong histories worked out as being matters of principle, being independent, and as constructive partners in the Middle East. In South Sudan, where Norway likewise has a deep and proud history of engagement in the pursuit of peace, New Zealand personnel for a number of years have also added real value to the UN peacekeeping mission. And a former parliamentary colleague of ours, David Shearer, is doing a seriously important job as the head of the UN mission there. Given our close alignment of values and perspectives, it's only natural that we should do more together, both bilaterally and on the world stage. To take this important work forward, New Zealand has strengthened our presence in the Nordic region. The reopening of the New Zealand Embassy in Stockholm, with accreditations to Norway and our other Nordic friends, will allow us to engage more actively and achieve more together. In times, ladies and gentlemen, of global uncertainty, New Zealand and Norway need to be working more closely together. States like ours have much to lose, including when repair jobs are going on. Well, either that's a pretty rugged borer. States like us have much to lose from global instability and the disregard of rules. In times like these, when multilateralism is under threat, when our values of fairness, equality and respect for human rights are being increasingly challenged, and when formally open trading nations are increasingly turning to protectionism, we need to be prepared to fight and to struggle and to battle to defend our values. And we need to deepen our cooperation with friends who share these values. We'd like to highlight a number of areas, if I may, where we need to cooperate more closely in asserting our values and tackling key issues on the global stage. Foremost amongst these is the critical issue of climate change and environmental sustainability. Norway and New Zealand are countries whose histories and national identities are informed by our very deep connection to the ocean and the environment. Climate change calls for global unified action, and that's why the New Zealand government has made climate change policy a priority. Norway and New Zealand work closely together in climate change negotiations in the UN, as well as through various coalitions, including the Carbon Neutrality Coalition and the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform. Both Norway and New Zealand have set ambitious targets in achieving carbon neutrality, and there's much to learn from each other as we work toward these and encourage others to play their part. We're also natural partners on polar issues. As original signatories, we work together in the Antarctic Treaty System to protect Antarctica's pristine environment and manage the pressures of tourism. Norway made a significant contribution to the negotiations when a New Zealand and United States proposal to establish the world's largest marine protected area in the Ross Sea region in Antarctica got over the line in 2016. It's critical that we work together to see more of the proposed pristine marine environment protected in areas such as Antarctica, and that those ambitions gain our agreement. New Zealand welcomes Norway's focus on oceans issues, particularly as they relate to Pacific small island developing states. We share common interests in supporting these countries to realise the full potential of their blue economy in a sustainable way. I don't know whether you frequently look at a map like that, but it doesn't have the Pacific on it. It's very Euro-orientated. But out in the Pacific, going from the United States across all the way to Japan and down south to Australia and New Zealand, is a huge theatre filled with small island populations, and they all desperately need our help. And there are huge challenges for countries like Australia and New Zealand, who understand those regions and those areas more clearly, to ensure that we uplift their economic and social progress as we're seeking to uplift ours. And any interest from this part of the world, and dare I say it, that would also go for the Caribbean nations as well, is highly valued and appreciated. Our own region, the Pacific, matters deeply in New Zealand. Our prosperity and security are intertwined with it, and we appreciate Norway's interest in the Pacific, both in its role as a principled partner, and I emphasise the word principled partner, as a potential champion for the Pacific, and other small island developing states within the multilateral system. There's much we can do together in championing open rules-based trade, both in the WTO and bilaterally. This is more important than ever, given the serious threat, as we all know, is being posed now to the WTO. At the same time, we want to promote trade policies which ensure trade benefits are shared among all peoples in our societies and that support our broader social and environmental goals, for example, by imposing disciplines on harmful fossil fuel subsidies. We're also reliable friends and partners to each other in our respective regions. New Zealand, ladies and gentlemen, values Norway's knowledge of Europe and the unique perspective it has as a European Union neighbour. In turn, New Zealand has much to share from its knowledge of East Asia and experience in the Pacific. The Pacific may seem distant, as I said, but it is a strategically important and increasingly contested space, and it is a region that welcomes the positive and constructive contribution made by European partners. He's back. But it is our bilateral cooperation where the greatest potential lies. Given our close alignment of values and perspectives, there is considerable scope for mutually beneficial cooperation and dialogue on domestic policy issues. New Zealand believes there is much we can learn from each other in areas such as social policy, climate change, and innovation. That's why we are here today, and from here on in, to learn from Norway's success in marrying economic policy with environmental stewardship. We especially admire your prudence in using your oil and gas wealth with the Government Pension Fund Global, now valued at over $1 trillion, to shift from being a petrostate to an investor state. And can I say, as one who's been around in politics for some time, and watched how other nations treated this massive gift by way of oil, in contrast to how your country did it, then all I can say, and I'm not saying it because I'm here to ingratiate myself with a Norwegian audience here in April of 2019, but some of us have been saying it for decades, that was what needed to be done, that a gift like that needed to be preserved as an investment for the day it ran out and to subscribe to the continuance of a highly successful society. And may I also say, by way of paradoxical observation, that this was happening at a time when the cross-political divide of Norway seemed to agree with the strategy, and how hard that is to get when you're trying to run a democracy, where a huge majority of the population see the wisdom of putting things away for the future by way of savings. And it was with great jealousy we were examining your GDP figures on the way over here, which we have done for a long time, but to give ourselves an updated version to see how successful you're doing. As I say, given our close alignment of values and perspectives, there's considerable scope for mutually beneficial cooperation and dialogue on domestic policy issues. And can I say we admire too Norway's sustainable fisheries management regime. New Zealand is therefore keen to learn from Norwegian successes as a way of furthering our national interests. And we are barely scratching the surface of the potential in our trade and investment relationships. Two-way trade in goods and services between New Zealand and the Nordic countries amounted to US $848 million for the year ending June 2018. And services trade was slightly more at around, were a similar figure, around $660 million as well. Now, those are not great figures, but we're not here just to talk trade. We're here really to talk about the need on the international theatre of countries that share our values to work more closely together, given the massive challenges that are being proposed to the world from certain quarters these days. This isn't to say that these are trifling trade volumes, but it's about forging mutually beneficial partnerships, tapping into expertise, and drawing on our respective strengths. Nordic countries are amongst the most innovative and technologically advanced countries in the world. And as a region, you represent one of the largest investors in industrial research and development. We are enthusiastic partners with you in these endeavours. Technology in New Zealand is the fastest growing sector and our highest earning industry per capita now. New Zealand boasts one of the best business environments in the world, having been consistently ranked #1 in the world for ease of doing business by the World Bank, as well as second in the annual Prosperity Index and third in the Economic Freedom Index. New Zealand is ranked second in the world for lack of public sector corruption by Transparency International. Needless to say, we were beaten by a Nordic country for the first place. New Zealand also offers opportunities in the fast-growing economies of Asia Pacific. We were the first developed country in the world to sign a free trade agreement with China in 2008, and we're the only country with trade agreements with China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. And the recently adopted Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement also provides access to 11 of the region's most dynamic and prosperous economies. It is, of course, the links between people that lie at the heart of any strong relationship. And despite our geographic distance, New Zealand and the Nordic countries are not strangers. Indeed, travellers from the Nordic region were amongst the first Europeans to reach our shores. Nordic whalers came to our shores in the early 19th century, and later that century, in the 1870s, a large cohort of Scandinavians emigrated to New Zealand, including 365 Norwegians alongside Danes and Swedes, and they established communities like Norsewood and Dunnivirk that still thrive today. The Premier of New Zealand at the time, Julius Vogel, ordered a study into how well the Scandinavian migrants had settled in New Zealand. Norwegians were rated the most successful of the Scandinavian migrant groups, which will come to no surprise to anyone in today's audience. Now, there was another wave of Nordic migration after World War II. So while relatively small, our historic people-to-people links remain strong. And today, for instance, I have here with me my Chief of Staff, whose name is Mr. John Johansson, whose father was one of those Danes who immigrated with his family as part of the post-war Scandinavian diaspora. My senior private secretary is Helen Lahtinen, who's also here this afternoon, Swedish-born of Finnish parents. And my chief press secretary's family, he couldn't get on this trip, by the way, are of Norwegian origin. So my office, therefore, embodies New Zealand's and Nordic relations about as well as possible. Today, New Zealand continues to be a popular destination for Norwegians, where nearly 5,000 Norwegians visit our country every year. Can I say just before I conclude that as a long-time observer of the success of Norway and the peculiarity of where it was coming from within its political system, it is a real privilege to be here and to observe with over time. The last time I was here was in 1995, by the way. It's quite a long time ago. But to see just how far you've come and how successful you've been and what a model you've been in terms of being internationally responsible with your economic success. It's a tribute to you. An uncapped working holiday scheme has also been in place since July 2005, enabling young Norwegian and New Zealand nationals to work for up to a year in our respective countries. In conclusion, we have a solid and warm foundation for our bilateral relations. We're here to build upon that foundation because, as small democracies with so many shared values, we can learn much from each other to the benefit of both Norwegian and New Zealand interests. Thank you for your time this afternoon.
Thank you so much, sir. If I may kick off the discussion with a question, could you say a little bit about what you see as the main challenges for the international rule of law? Because you touched upon that in your speech, where New Zealand and Norway have so much in common, tend to vote very similarly in multilateral organizations and so on. What do you see as the main challenges now?
Well, there are challenges to the rules-based system. Those challenges have a range of origins, many from big countries, but with some aligned with those big countries against the other interests of other nations in what should be a global world order when it comes to trade, such as the rules of the WTO, which is under serious threat. And that has happened with enormous speed all of a sudden. And we need to be defending that wisdom of establishment all those years ago, bearing in mind that it was never difficult. So it's never easy to deal with the WTO or any other international organization, or the EU or any other grouping of power structures and people structures. But the opposite, or failure, is so much worse. And if you would ask me the biggest challenge, apart from climate change, that's what it is right now, the rules-based system.
Okay, we have time for some questions. In the back there first, please.
Thank you. My name is Sigrid. I'm an environmentalist and peace activist. And of course, I agree with you that the international rules-based system is under pressure. And I wanted to thank you particularly for the work that New Zealand did promoting the progress on nuclear disarmament and signing and ratifying the nuclear ban treaty that was passed by the UN in 2017. And I was wondering if you could comment on, or I was hoping that New Zealand would be supporting Norway in pushing for an international treaty on marine plastic pollution to combat plastic pollution in the world's ocean. Could you say something about that?
When you raise it, let me say that we are seriously willing to be part of the dialogue as we build towards it. If you went to Indonesia, you would see that this biggest Islamic country in the world, which is itself a democracy and just had an election 2 weeks ago, is seriously focused on that very issue you talk about. But then when you go to the Pacific, and I dare say it's the same in the Caribbean, you'll see the worst despolation of plastic poisoning of the environment. So if you want to know where New Zealand's view is, we're in.
In the back there first.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tēnā koutou. My name is Mark Lantain from the Arctic University of Norway in Tromsø. Thank you very much. I have a question about the current situation with relations between New Zealand and China. There almost appears to be two different narratives starting to appear in this particular relationship. On one hand, you have China as a very important economic partner, a free trade partner, as you pointed out. And on the other, you have China as a potential challenger to the status quo. There's been a lot of debate in both New Zealand academia and in the press about what China represents to New Zealand policy going forward. So I wanted to ask first, which of these two narratives do you think best describes the relationship at present? And second, what do you see as the kind of path forward for New Zealand relations with China? Thank you.
The new government's foreign policy approach was best evidenced by a speech that was given to the Lowy Institute in Sydney shortly after becoming the government. The title was The Pacific Reset, and we made it very clear that we were going into this as a new government with our eyes wide open to what we faced. In particular, it is our precept as a government, or particularly mine anyway, that if you're dealing with small countries like the Cook Islands, or dare I say it, Niue, you should treat them as your equal, as we expect to be treated as equal, even though we're a small population of 4.9 million people. Now, you're 5.3 million people, but size does not mean preferential behaviour of treatment in our view. You treat the whole world the same and with respect. So that's a key part of our approach, including beefing up our foreign policy assets our men and women resources on the ground, and above all our overseas developmental aid. That said, if you're going to have your eyes wide open, you should observe developing trends, so to speak. And when we say the Pacific is a contested space, it is for a number of reasons more contested today, because certain nations that played a role have retreated or neglected their obligations. The United States is one of them. And I would not tell you today what I wouldn't tell the United States to their face, that you walked out in 1945 and you forgot what's important. Right? Just like General Douglas MacArthur told you before you went into the war, that you can't neglect this part of the world. The British, as you know, have retreated and with their joining of the EU. The French have not, but in terms of their engaged enrolment, yes, they had, whereas the Macron government has changed. They seem to be back now, all of a sudden. And you've got serious now really a new developing, scrambling for shape interest from Japan, which is fascinating and of great comfort to us. That all of a sudden they realise they themselves have got a huge stake to ensure this time the Pacific remains the tranquil, peaceful place it is. And then you have this huge Islamic country, Indonesia, that has come in giant steps from being a disjunctive, unconnected, unrelated power base to being a democracy where with some understanding of moderate behaviour and how important their role is. Now, these are exciting developments, but they all take time. When you talk about China, let me say, we have a free trade agreement with China. It is not the best deal we could have got, but because we were the first. And it's very rarely that the first person who's the first customer for a product gets the best product. That's nature and commerce itself. But we're flat out trying to get it updated and get a better deal. All we are saying is that we want, in the developments and progress of the Pacific people, for there to be rules based on fairness and proper behaviour, that it not be constructed on what you would, in a democracy, regard as unethical behaviour. There are many images to what I'm saying, but I'm afraid too many people in this world are just far too polite at the enormous cost of freedom and progress. In our case, some of us have been in the Pacific for thousands of years. But here's the paradox. The indigenous people of New Zealand 5,000 years ago came from China. All the DNA across the Pacific and back to New Zealand demonstrates that. And I don't want to sound in the way that the Wild West sounds, but we did get there first. And we intend to be respected for it.
There and then there.
My name is Eric Hagen. I'm from the Norwegian Support Committee for Western Sahara. We've been following the last 12 years the New Zealand imports of phosphate rock from Western Sahara. New Zealand government has a fantastic policy on the decolonisation of that territory. In Security Council, New Zealand government played an excellent role, voted the right ways or abstained at the right points. Jacinda Ardern, your Prime Minister, has a wonderful knowledge about the conflict. We've met her. She's been to the refugee camps in Algeria. But the companies in New Zealand, the private businesses, work the other way. So New Zealand is today the only importing country besides China of phosphates from Western Sahara. The number of importers have decreased from 13 countries to now 2. The Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs stated very beautifully in Parliament 2 weeks ago something that echoes very nicely the New Zealand position, that any trade of goods that violate the right to consent of the people of the territory, that will be illegal. And that echoes the New Zealand government's position. There was a letter sent by your government to the importers. There was a meeting last year saying that the New Zealand government expects the importers to find alternative sources than Western Sahara. And the question is, is a general question on interpretation of what role the government has in instructing or inviting companies to respect principles of international law and human rights. For instance, would the New Zealand government, your office, put its resources available to aid these importers to find alternative sources, diplomatically, for instance, or financially, to improve the human rights so that it is more in line with the New Zealand government position?
You got a marvelous way of phrasing that question. What you, in the end, I get what you're saying, and you have got the detail right, and there is a serious knowledge of this by our Prime Minister, who visited there when she was a much younger person. So there's an acuity of knowledge there, and we have looked at how do we, without interfering with business practice, point to a different future. Can I just say, environmentally, in terms of sound environmental behaviour, the answer is obvious anyway. I'm happy to tell you that I think it's obvious anyway, that that's not a product we can carry on using for a start. So would we, though, engage in promoting, by taxpayer subsidies, delinquent commercial behaviour? No, we're not going to do that. But if we can find a way out of there, and quicker, much more quickly than it would seem by the correspondence and evidence you're reading, we will. There is one question, though. This is a dispute in the Sahara as to who owns what, where, and when. And we're a long way from being able to, way out above the penguins, deep in the South Pacific, we're a long way from being able to judge the rightness of that cause. But that's not what we're arguing. I suppose we're more arguing that environmentally this is not a product we should be using. It contaminates the waterways in the end. We'll get the same result, but for different reasons, I suppose. I have to tell you, we just hesitate sometimes when these raging battles are going offshore to jump in and, with our resource base and with huge local problems in our own backyard in the Pacific, to intervene. But I get your point, and I'm very much aware, because of the Prime Minister's past involvement, of the issue you're speaking about. I don't dispute what you're saying.
Foreign Minister Peters, my name is Luke Courtney. I'm an American over here for my younger children. Just parenthetically, my father was in China, Burma, India during the war. My Uncle John was in a submarine off Japan, and my Uncle Homer was a U.S. Navy Seabee. You talked about solidarity, but in 1985, New Zealand declared itself nuclear-free, which still critically undermines the nuclear deterrent solidarity of allies in the Pacific. Now, in about 2017, the increasingly impressive Red Chinese Navy came to the Baltic Sea and held joint naval exercises, shore bombardment off of Estonia. And I circulated an email saying if Asia could come to threaten Europe, then maybe Europe should expand NATO to the Pacific and Asia. And about a month later, Secretary General Stoltenberg came out and said that, and he's been to the Pacific. So my question is twofold. Number one, if NATO becomes a global treaty organization and expands to Asia and the Pacific to deter war, do you think New Zealand will join it? And number two, until the Chinese pay for their islands, or at least de-escalate the tension, will New Zealand consider suspending your nuclear-free policy?
Well, first of all, I want to say, just to make sure the record's straight, that our small country, its loss of life in the First World War, it was above any Western nation, and that goes for the Second World War as well. Above any Western nation. So we know what it's like to make sacrifices, and we got there 2 years before the United States twice. Remember? 2014 and 2013, and 1940 and 1939. That said, we're great friends with the United States in the historic context. But in 1984-85, there was a movement to condemn the use of nuclear weapons, and the majority of people in our country within 6 years, within 5 years, came to agree with that. The government took a stance, and the opposition by 1989-90 was saying that's the right stance. And so if you're asking me, would we suspend our desire for there to be a nuclear-free world? I don't believe democratically my country would. Now, I know that it does have serious complications. But what you're telling me, bluntly, is that the peace of this world is predicated on the power to use them one day if they have to. Surely that's what you're saying to me. But we would rather work in a world where we could, without being naive, sort things out with conventional weapons if we have to, but not weapons that may destruct all of humanity in one blast. That's the summated version of your answer. Will New Zealand change from being that? No, it won't, because frankly, I would put the proportion of New Zealanders for that policy above 80%.
Will you join NATO, sir?
Well, again, NATO has got problems in NATO. Before they rush off to Pacific, they need to sort out the problems where they got right now. Do you not think?
I think I saw a hand back there. Yes.
Minister. My name is Sam Davis. I'm a master's student here in the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, and I have a question about conflict prevention and New Zealand's foreign policy in regards to it. Norway has a strong tradition in conflict prevention and is proud of its international image as an honest broker, which is something New Zealand is also proud of as having. And when the Jordanian Prince Hassan bin Talal came to Christchurch after the March 15th terror attack, he said that our country was now uniquely placed to help make the world a more peaceful place. Along those lines, last year, the independent group, the New Zealand Alternative Group, published a report that recommended that New Zealand consolidate its work in conflict prevention by creating a conflict prevention unit. Your reaction to that report at the time was that New Zealand was already doing a lot in conflict prevention but could always do more. So my question is, has the government looked at the recommendations in the report and looked at how it could enhance its international conflict prevention work? And have you discussed New Zealand's conflict prevention work with your counterparts in the Nordic countries during this visit? Thank you.
Hitherto, we've just been to Iceland to start this Nordic tour, and I can say that we talked a lot about a lot of things, but it didn't get down to that issue. No, there's a lot of other basic things we talked about. I think when you recite the time that began being an issue of conversation and possibly future direction, we in Foreign Affairs, or in my office and my staff, were seriously struggling with trying to get the resources for the multilateral and huge international issues we've got to be involved in. And you've got no idea how hard it is to go into the Minister of Finance's office day in, day out, trying to get money for international causes. They all talk, as we all know, and it probably happens in Norway as well, although you've got a proud record of 1% ODA, which is a standout record, and I admire it immensely. But they all talk about how they want to be internationally responsible until you go to the Treasurer or the Finance Minister, and they're as tight as you know what. And the last conversation I had was with my equivalent in Saudi Arabia, and he said to me, "You've got no idea how tough it is to get money out of our guy." And I thought, yeah, I do. I got plenty idea how difficult it is. So my point would have been then, have we got, it's all very well to say things, because, you know, politicians are fast on the lip and slow, they're fast on the lip and slow on the hip. So if you're going to say something, back it up with money. So it's a work in progress still.
Did I see a hand over here? Oh, sorry. There.
Hi, my name is Nina Berglund. I run a website here in Norway that does Norwegian news in English. And I was just wanting, you touched a bit on oil and the oil fund. Norway has not been entirely popular in the Pacific, or in your part of the Pacific recently. Norway's state oil company, now called Equinor, is under a lot of criticism for what it's doing in the Australian Bight. And just a couple weeks ago, the Crown Prince was confronted in Fiji about the ramifications of Norway's oil production on Pacific Island nations. Can you comment on that, and do you see any hypocrisy or conflict between Norway working in the Pacific, or you're saying trying to help Pacific Island nations while generating oil and carbon emissions and continuing to explore in the Arctic?
It's a very generous invitation to get involved with a domestic problem. And I hesitate to do that other than to say we are very familiar with Statoil. Most politicians would have been in New Zealand lobbied by Statoil before they changed their name recently. The second thing, though, is that Norway is internationally appreciated as being a country that understands the important connection between extraction and the new safe environment. I mean, there are so many things to clean up our environment worldwide which cannot happen automatically. They require now certain extracting industries to help us do that. Norway is regarded as a very internationally responsible a contributor to sound environmentalism or practical environmentalism and a world leader in the environment. And it shows when you travel around Norway or when you travel around, did I say, parts of Scandinavia, how well they've done compared to the rest of the world, where wholesale depopulation and damage is the order of the day. That said, I can say, as someone who's pretty familiar with the Pacific, that there's not a raging controversy with respect to Statoil in the Pacific. There was in my country, where they were seeking to get an oil license off the north coast of the Bay of Islands and the very northern reaches of New Zealand, where a person happened to come from, and for a start, and there were a lot of people concerned offshore drilling and the escape of oil, excepting, of course, the Norwegian record has been exemplary when it comes to their responsibility in offshore drilling. So it's very confusing in that context. Controversy in the Pacific? No. When it comes to what happened with respect to Fiji, I'd like to get behind it and know more about it, because there are a number of competing interests in the Pacific now, and many of them, their unstated purpose needs to be known. Norway, I don't believe, is one of those countries.
I'm looking at my watch. You promised to give us 50 minutes, and you have, sir. I want to thank you for giving an overview of for your foreign policy objectives and for being here to respond to questions and comments, and all of you for coming. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.